Good evening, everyone, and thank you for tuning in for the inaugural episode of Higher Education Generation. Tonight, we are going to be discussing a very fraught topic for many, how to get admitted to an Ivy League school. My name is Jill Janofsky. I am the founder of Achieve College Counseling here in Baltimore, and joining me are two highly renowned college counselors from Colorado who are going to introduce themselves right now.
Yeah, welcome everybody. My name is Sawyer. I'm one of the co-founders of Virtual College Counselors. Before becoming an independent educational consultant or an independent college counselor, I worked in college admissions at Hendrix College and have just always really had a passion for higher ed and helping students and guiding and mentoring and all that kind of good stuff. So looking forward to a discussion.
And I'm Jess. I'm the other co-founder of Virtual College Counselors. And my background's actually in forensic psychology. So I'm a licensed professional counselor, but I also had careers working for the Army, working at University of Colorado Boulder and serving on their scholarship committees. And the one common thread for me was helping people figure out what their next step was. And the most fulfilling space for that has been this high school to college transition. We're excited to be here.
Thank you, guys. So before I start asking my questions, there's a couple of things I would like to clarify. One thing is really the impetus behind this topic is that I believe, and I don't believe I'm alone in this, that there are a lot of myths that obscure the facts when it comes to applying to what we call highly selective or highly rejective, as we say as college counselors, schools. And when we say that term, we actually mean schools that reject 90% or more of their applicants. That means that they that means that they accept 10% or fewer of all students who apply. And I would like to make it clear, the Ivy League encompasses 8 different schools in a historic athletic conference in the Northeast. But when we talk about highly selective schools or highly rejective schools, we're not only talking about those 8 schools exclusively. There are many others on that list that are also highly selective that are not technically Ivy League. For example, MIT, Stanford, University of Chicago, Hopkins, right in my neck of the woods here in Baltimore, and even a couple of public schools like UCLA. So I just want to clarify that before we get started. So with that clarified, I'm going to jump right into my questions for both Jessica and Sawyer. The first question's for both of you. So during the past 5 years, I have personally witnessed tremendous attitude shifts towards higher education. We have students and families really questioning if going to college for 4 years and taking on debt or spending a large portion of one's life savings to do that is really worth the cost. But one thing has remained consistent throughout these shifts, and that is the fierce competition for seats at Ivy League and Ivy League-like schools. Why do you think that is?
Oh man, that's a good question. So, what I'll preface is by saying is like most college counselors, I have a tumultuous relationship with the Ivy League-esque institutions. I think when I was younger and maybe like a little bit more, maybe rebel without a cause or like Rage Against the Machine kind of vibes, like I thought I would oftentimes really, really lay into Ivy League or highly selective, highly rejective universities. I oftentimes will get this question from our students, right? Is there an actual worth to going to a more well-known name? And as much as I would like to say that there's no value to that, that would be a lie. I think that there is in our culture, embedded in this country, this idea that if you make it to some place that everybody knows about, then you must be smart, or you must be capable, or you must be, incredibly hardworking. I think that whether it's true or not, most people could argue until the cows came home. But I definitely think that there is something in the culture that breeds this idea that if you can make it there, you can make it anywhere kind of idea. And they're not inherently wrong, because obviously if you make it there, that name carries a lot of value for the people who are going to be hiring. It certainly is going to open a lot of doors that maybe a lesser known college name might not, even if you're a harder working student. And also you're going to be surrounded by people who, by the vast majority, are going to come from wealthy, powerful, higher socioeconomic backgrounds that could become very strong support networks as you make that journey outside of college. So I do think that even though we see this thing that's happening quite frequently about is college worth it, there are still students that are like, oh, well, I only want to spend 10K on a college education. But if I got into one of these fancy schools, like I would take out a second mortgage, or I would, take out 20,000 in loans, whatever it might be. I do think that there's this unique myth and cultural power that these names and these highly selective universities still hold.
And I think it expands way further than just the U.S. Like it's a lot of our
Oh, yeah.
international students who are really focusing on those highly selective schools, because if they're going to come to the U.S. for a degree, they want it to carry weight when they go back home. And there's 4,000 colleges in the U.S. alone. Of course, they're not well known across the globe, not all of them, but a handful are for various reasons, not always reasons that they should be. Um, yeah, I think it's a tough thing. Like, I get the appeal. I get the appeal of being the one of the few who gets to be admitted. Like, what's the secret sauce kind of
Yeah.
thing. There's something to be said for that. I still have my acceptance letter from UPenn, because I felt proud that I was admitted, and I arguably was not the most qualified applicant. But there's no inherent value to a name of a school. Like, I think people have in their minds that if you attend a school that is highly selective or highly rejective, that suddenly just by being there and having that name on your diploma, that opens the doors. When in reality, like, no door opens unless you show up. Unless you like turn the knob and open the door. The doors don't just like magically fly open. A lot of these schools do have vast alumni networks that are, like Sawyer said, incredibly wealthy. And there is definitely some value to, moving in those circles, right? And starting to create that generational wealth that we're seeing in these institutions, the legacies, right? But it's tough.
And I would even argue, building off of that, Jess, and I think that this is something that a lot of people maybe don't think about, is that sure, those universities are nationally, internationally renowned. Everybody knows them. But when we think about it, like if you go to the University of Alabama or Auburn and Alabama, everybody knows those in that area. I would argue that if you go to a big sports school, everybody knows that in the Southeast. So it's one of those things where it's on a larger scale, but I think sometimes students forget that, like, I have worked with plenty of students who strategically went to a flagship because that's where they wanted to live. That's where they wanted to practice law or practice medicine or teach in schools. And like to them, that name carried just as much power as a Harvard, just for free, as opposed to the cost of a Harvard or the emotional, chronological investment that people are putting in to get to that point, if they even can.
When students are reaching the decision process, when they have been admitted to these highly rejective schools, the one question we ask, especially when money comes into play, and like these families maybe don't qualify for aid, like lower income families do a lot better with the Ivy League aid than the middle class and the obviously the upper class. But the one question that nobody in my lifetime has been able to answer, and I open the door if anyone's listening and has an answer, please feel free to chime in. What inherent value does one school provide over another? Like, what can Harvard do for you that Arizona State University can't? And no one's been able to actually answer that. And despite not having an answer, they're still driven to make decisions based on that, like, societal kind of drive or whatever it is that drives people. But I have yet to come across a school that is somehow leagues beyond another without the student having to play the role of making it
Right.
better, like making
Yeah,
it
I'm
better.
really Yeah, I'm really glad that you brought up cost, because there's so much at play when it comes to the net cost of any school you choose, whether it's an
Oh, yeah.
Ivy or really any school, because you factor in things like scholarships and or loans if should you choose to take them out. But the thing that's always mystified me is that Ivy League schools specifically have a ton of money for financial aid. There is a joke in higher education that Harvard is just a big hedge fund with a college attached to it,
Mhm.
to to make it nonprofit, basically. And they're criticized for that because, in theory, a school like Harvard could pay for everyone's full tuition and give them a pony and still have millions at the end
I
of
mean, they
that.
could educate the
So,
people who apply, right? Like they could
exactly.
educate an extra like 30,000 students a year.
Exactly. So when we ask, is it really worth the cost? We're not just talking about just the stated tuition on the website. Is it worth what your family is going to pay out of pocket, if anything? The other thing that's very interesting is that many of these schools have started giving financial aid to families who actually make what I would consider to be pretty high or middle upper class salaries. Like, you can be eligible for financial aid at Harvard and Yale if your family, I think, makes up to $150,000 a year. I mean, that's a
And I think
pretty,
it's 250 at Princeton.
Yeah.
Princeton is the
yeah,
most generous of all of them.
right. So these questions about, like, oh, who can afford it? I mean, it's not something I've ever really been able to answer super explicitly. What are your thoughts on that?
I don't
Yeah,
think any school's worth paying full price.
that's
But I like
truthfully, yeah, I
you're
agree.
talking to a couple Pell Grant recipients over here.
Can you explain that?
Yeah. So if you're below a certain income threshold for the number of people in your family, when you apply for FAFSA, which is the free application for federal student aid, if you're below that threshold, then you might be offered the Pell Grant. You will be offered the Pell Grant to different degrees. It's not always the full Pell Grant. It depends on that income level. But it's free money that you don't have to pay back. And I was in California, so I also had the Cal Grant, which California has a separate financial aid application for state aid, and they're also incredibly generous. Which is why when we're talking about like UCs being affordable on the surface, they're not, unless you have like a full salary just hanging out that you're just going to like pass over to a school each year. But it's because of all these other systems that are in place to make it affordable. But yeah, like coming from, a situation where the cost does matter and it did matter and it should matter. I find it really hard to stomach shelling out full price for anything. Like even buying my car. Like
Yeah,
I why?
the thing I would add to that is that, and this goes back to the point that Jess made earlier, and we talk with our students a lot, is that very rarely, if ever, can a college magically turn a student into, someone who's going to be successful. Like, sure, there are experiences, there are friends, there are mentors, there are classes that you might take that help push a student to be more engaged, or maybe a student had to be more engaged during high school to set themselves up for success. But it's not like a student shows up on an Ivy League campus and they go through like a wacky like factory floor montage where they're like getting equipped with all the brains and skills and talents they need to be successful on campus. Like, most students are going to get out what they put in, and that's honestly the thing that is both exciting for a lot of students and also terrifying for a lot of families, because a lot of families think if we can get a good school with a good name and a good ranking, that everything's just going to fall in line. And to that, I would say that there's a lot of high schoolers that were told this idea. I always call it the checklist, this mythology of a checklist that you're gonna take your first midterms in like 6th, 7th grade. And you're gonna do great on them, and then that's gonna set you up for success. And you do good in your middle school math, so you can get in the advanced math track. And then once you're in the advanced math track, you're in APs. And then once you're in the APs, you get your ACT scores, and then like you go to college, and it's all just gonna work out. And what a lot of students realize is that they are still being sold this mythology of this checklist. And then they get to the end and they sacrificed and they did a lot to make this checklist work, things they didn't want to do, things that they might have not enjoyed. And they don't have nearly as many options as they thought they did, because at the end of the day, price becomes arguably the number one determining factor of where a student can or cannot go to college. Simply because if you can't afford it, you cannot afford it, period. It's not like you can finagle your way or ask for another thing or pick up an extracurricular that's going to magically make your family have an extra $500K in the bank. So I think that that's something that that myth of the checklist continues into college, where a lot of students are like, oh, if I get into that good college, then I'll get a whole new checklist, and then I can just keep checking boxes and push off the reality, which is that there are no to-do lists or check boxes in life. Like, life throws curveballs. You have to adjust. You have to be there. You have to be present. You can't make it alone. You have to have a support network of friends or mentors or family or whatever it might look like. And I think that a lot of students are very unhealthily addicted, I would even argue, to this idea of a checklist, because it adds maybe order to the chaos of their lives.
But it's also like ingrained in their education system. They're used to having that rubric in English class. They know exactly what they need to write to get the A.
Yeah.
Right? Like, we're training them to feel like everything is a checklist. So then they wind up doing these things because they think it looks good for college, when in reality, what looks good for college is meaningful engagement and self-discovery and personal growth and all these things that are incredibly daunting ideas, but students do it. They just don't realize it. And they don't realize that that piece of them is what schools are actually looking for, and not just like, oh, you did that research project over the summer because your dad knew someone who worked at Stanford who could get you into a lab.
Right.
Yes, so that is a myth that let's address that right now. This idea, oh, I have to do something like, work at a lab at Stanford in order to put that on my college application. Admissions officials have become very, very good at kind of being able to decipher which experiences are meaningful for the students and which were purely to put on the list. Would you agree with that?
I would 100% agree with that. I usually will tell students that one of the saddest moments in an admission counselor's careers is when they find a really cool student on paper, they meet them for the first time, and they start talking to them and like want to talk about the cool stuff they've done, not because they're like testing them, but because the admission counselor is legitimately excited. Most people who work in higher education are not there for the salaries. They are there for interacting, mentoring, guiding, being a part of this process. And one of the most depressing things is when you see something cool and you're like, hey, like, talk about this. And it's so obvious that the student did not absorb any of it. They might not remember they did it. They might not have wanted to do it. And sure, those are all different conversations. But for me, it really makes me not want to fight for you as much as a student who comes in and has shown that their heart and is in it. And that doesn't mean every student needs to sacrifice their free time or their mental or emotional health. Like, Jess and I have talked about this with all our students. Like, no college and no application is worth being unhappy and unhealthy to get there. It just simply is not worth it. When we think of our commodities and our capital in the world, time is arguably the most precious we have. We can't get it back, and we can't buy more. In theory, there are some ways to get more time out of the day, but it's not like you can make the day 28 hours. So in that sense, I think that, I don't know. I think that students need to be aware that you don't need to do things that look good for college. You just need to do things you enjoy doing, and that will look good for college. It doesn't matter what it is. And that might not be everybody's opinion in the admissions world, but I'm going to go ahead and let you know that not every admission counselor thinks the same. They're not reading all applications at the same time of day. Some of them are at 8 a.m. on a Monday, and some of them are at 4:55 on a Friday. It's part of the process. Admission counselors are human. They're going to be different. But most admission counselors that I have met and worked with, they continue to do this because they love working with students, and they really believe that they're making some kind of significant change, and they want to see students excited about this process, not doing things because they think it looks good.
Yeah. And I think students don't realize what activities actually are until they see the Common App drop-down menu, where there's like some categories they can start to like compartmentalize what they've done. But we have students literally every year who are like, does this count? Does this count? Like, yeah, if you weren't eating, sleeping, and going to school, that's an activity. Like, if maybe not like hanging out with friends, but for the most part, they're engaging in things. And I can't tell you the number of times a student will say like, well, I don't really do much. I play soccer for school. I'm on this club team, and I like volunteer and like coach soccer on weekends. I'm like, that's a full-time job that you're doing. That's 40 hours a week at least of engagement outside of school. That's enough.
It's almost like if they enjoy doing it and it's a natural part of their life, it doesn't count.
Right,
You know?
because it's not for college, it was for them. And I don't know how to change this. I think it really has to happen at like the elementary or middle school level when, like students are typically encouraged to pick up an instrument or try a sport or something, but have it be more like, let's think about your strengths and opportunities for growth and like, where do you want to spend your time? Do you want to do a team sport or would karate be better? Like, I think there isn't enough conversation about it. It's just parents either making decisions or kids chiming in and maybe not for when they're young, they shouldn't be thinking about what they're doing it for. And that's the best part. It's when they get to the age of critical thinking and they're like, oh, maybe I shouldn't do this anymore because this would look better. Like NHS, National Honor Society. No one
I
cares.
was,
Like they have your transcript. We already know that to get into NHS, you need a certain GPA and it may vary by school, but it's like you got to be a good student and then you have to do volunteer work and then you're in this club.
Yeah.
I would
NHS
rather see
is
students.
NHS is literally a participation trophy. Just putting that
Yeah.
out there.
Yeah, that's I
Yeah,
will
that's like
off.
number 10. If you want to fill them all out and you only have 9 and that's your 10th, awesome. But unless it was meaningful for you, which it can be, NHS can be great for some students because there is structure to the volunteer work, right?
Yeah.
There's certain amount of hours that need to, be taken or whatever, and students need to figure out ways to get those hours, and that can be a valuable experience for some students. But the number of times that we talk to a junior or senior who are like, oh, and I'm in NHS. And I'm like, hey, like, do you like NHS? And they're like, no.
Then don't do
Yeah.
it.
Why are
Doesn't
you
matter.
like, well, my mom's making me, or like for my
It's
college apps.
super redundant, and that's what I tell students. If NHS is to show that you have a good GPA, they have your transcript. If NHS is to show that you're doing volunteer work, just list the volunteer work. If NHS is to show that you have a leadership position, that's an arguable reason, but also you got to show me that you were doing something in that leadership position, not just like during the 20-minute lunch once a month, like lunch meeting that you like hit the gavel a bunch and then read off what you were supposed to do. Like there's things in NHS that are good, but none of it is ever summarized by just NHS. Like it's all the pieces. Once again, kind of going back to that idea that getting that name doesn't matter. It's what the student's doing within it that actually provides the nutrition for the app reader.
And it's wild to talk to these students who think that they don't do anything and that there's nothing for their activities list. And then we're like, we see behind them, right? They're meeting us in their bedroom on a computer. Like, what's that mannequin behind you? Like, oh, well, I go thrift shopping and I get a bunch of clothes that I cut up and I sew new clothes that I then wear or sell. I'm like, okay, well, that's cool. Tell me more about that. She's like, yeah, I'm really into like fast fashion and like not fast fashion, I guess. And like, she knows everything about fashion and sustainability. And like, there's just so much that these kids know that they don't feel is good enough when in reality, that's what makes them stand out.
Right.
Like, tell
Yeah.
me about those things. I want to know that you taught yourself Hebrew on Duolingo because that's impressive. And it's hard to learn a language that doesn't have the same characters that you're used to reading.
I completely failed learning Hebrew in any medium, so I would I would
I can
definitely
read it and write it, and I have no idea what it means. Thank you, Hebrew school.
yeah. Okay, we clearly grew up in the same generation.
Yes.
Okay, but back to our topic. So I want to talk about this concept that has come up several times already in this conversation about good schools. I want my child to go to a good school. Part of our job as educational advisors, as consultants, is really broadening, I think, families' understanding of what makes a good school. There are these highly rejected schools that they might be good for your kid if they can get in, but they may be terrible fits for them too. And then there are these sort of lesser known schools that may provide amazing aid, that may support a student beautifully, that might have this amazing experience that it's just not as hyped up as all these other schools you've heard about. So I guess my question to you is, when students and families approach you at the beginning of their process with their sights set on the Ivy League, how do you go about advising them?
Usually we have a very frank conversation at the very beginning that any student that's only interested in the Ivy Leagues or we'll say the Ivy Leagues for now, is not thinking about fit. And we are very clear with them. And I usually will try and connect with a student. I'll go, look, when I was in high school, everybody talked about fit, college fit. No one told me what college fit was. It was this ephemeral, amorphous idea that we were just supposed to grab onto. And one of the things that both Jess and I do during the consultation is we talk about what do we think about when we think about fit. We're thinking about what academics are offered, what kind of professional training, finances, location, weather, campus culture, political climate. Is it close to a city, far from a city? There's, a lot of different pieces that go into fit. And I think that students have to get used to breaking fit down. It reminds me a lot of when I was thinking as you were like, what's a good college? I want my student to go to a good college. If you typed into Google, I want to buy a good car, what does that mean? What kind of car are you going to, is a good car an expensive car? Not always. Is a good car, one that can fit all your family members in when you're taking them to soccer practice? Is a good car something where you can take the hood down and, feel the wind in your hair? It's all about good is what's good for a person. There is no universal good school.
It's like asking for a good doctor, right? Sure, there's reviews and you want a doctor that doesn't have a bunch of malpractice suits against them and stuff. But if we're using that same logic of wanting that good doctor, then the Ivies are the furthest from the good school list for most students. You want a school that's supportive of students with mental health concerns. You want to all the things that they do start to identify that they're looking for don't exist in some of these highly selective institutions, or at least not inherently. They require effort on the student's part, but we know that students who are experiencing mental health crises don't have the energy to seek out that support if it's not readily available. As one baseline example, right?
Yeah.
It's like being on Amazon.
Yeah.
You read the good reviews and the bad reviews, but you can find that for every single school.
A good synopsis of this might just be the phrase, what is a good school for you? Right? If you can't answer what a good school is for you, you don't know what a good school is. Because Jess hit it, remarkably well, right? You could have a very smart, engaged student that goes to a high pressure cooker environment and cracks. You could also have that same student that goes to an honors program at a state university with a smaller cohort of students that are, maybe a little less academically focused and pressure cookery, but still really engaged, could find all their people. Or maybe they go to a small liberal arts school that has a better spread of students from those 3.2s to those 4.5 GPA kind of students. And it's one of those things where if you can't define what a good school is for you, the same way you can't define what a good car would be for you or a good house for you. When I'm going house shopping as maybe a recently wed couple, I'm not looking for a mansion. I'm also not looking for a shack. It's one of those things where if you can't answer what is good for you, then you'll never find a good college, at least not intentionally. You might stumble on them, but.
And it's this time of year that students start to figure out what fit actually is as they're making their college decisions. This is when we're getting the texts from students that are like, okay, I love these two schools for engineering and they're both options. They're both the same price. How do I actually decide? And that's when we start talking. I mean, we've told them to do this earlier sometimes, but that's when they're finally like, okay, now I can look at the course catalog and the course requirements and the labs and actually see where do I see myself? Where are those classes I want to take or the requirements I can palette? There's just so much to identify, I think, that they get overwhelmed and they don't, without guidance. And of course, our students have the luxury of working with us and it is a privilege. And there's a lot of students who don't have that. And it can be very hard to figure out what does it mean to have a good computer science program? Because is it the job placement rates? Because those are reported and that can be McDonald's. And there's nothing wrong with having a job at McDonald's, but when you're paying $90,000 a year for a computer science degree from, USC, you're hoping to have a job in your career field or career adjacent.
Yeah. So I think a lot of what's being described by both of you is branding. That's what this is. These schools, these highly rejected schools that get a ton of applications, that have, I guess you could say, the luxury of rejecting 90% of their students, are brands. But if you ask someone, okay, so why do you prefer Princeton over Dartmouth? Most, that's where we come in. We're here to educate, about those types of subtleties, you could say. But we're talking about brand names, that are very expensive, and you might be able to find a better deal elsewhere, and it's actually a better fit for you.
Right.
And that actually brings me to my next point, which is about deciphering the admissions rate of these schools and determining one's chances of getting admitted. So this is a myth that I think we should be talking about right now. This idea about legacy admissions and how much that actually helps students in the application pool. So when it comes to legacies, there are thousands of students nationally whose parents went to Ivy or Ivy-like schools. They're not all going to get into that school. And the amount of, and so people are like, oh, well, if I give the school, $1,000 a year, isn't that going to make a difference? Absolutely not. The amount of money
of those, sure.
The amount of money that would make that difference, it's an amount of money that only a handful of families in the United States have. And I think that this dovetails into very well when people ask, so what are the odds of getting in? If their admissions rate is 7%, if Yale's admissions rate is 7%, that means my chance of getting in is 93%. Or I'm sorry, my chance of getting rejected is 93%, and my chance of getting in is 7%. No. I'm just going to use a few examples. So Malia Obama, when she applied to Harvard as a double legacy, and her father was president of the United States at that time, she had a 100% chance of getting in. I think that's a very fair statement to make. I'm sure she did well academically, but 100%.
She went to a great school, and I'm sure had a great tutor or is a really good test taker. Like, I'm sure she was a qualified applicant who had that too.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the 100%.
Have no doubt about that. George Bush's daughter, who went to Yale, again, that was probably in a 100% situation. Their family is one of Yale's biggest donors ever, I think. Someone, I would say, just a regular student, well, not regular, but a student who doesn't have that legacy behind them, with perfect SAT scores, valedictorian, just like one of the top students in their community. I'm going to just guess, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, I'm going to guess their chances of getting admitted to an Ivy are like 1 in 3, 1 in 4, depending on other factors in their profile, more or less.
That might be super generous, because Harvard announced last year that they rejected like some 18,000 valedictorians or students with perfect SAT scores.
Yeah. You know
what? The odds of not getting in are still significantly higher.
Yeah.
That's true, but your chances of getting in with those credentials are obviously better than like everyone else.
But only if you're also an athlete or also a legacy or also
right.
Yeah, I think that's, and I can't remember which book it was, but one of the books, I say the books, like we all just read the exact same books in college admissions.
But we do, so you should tell your fact and I'll tell you the book.
Okay, I think it might be Who Gets In and Why, where they break down the actual, and these stats are older, and I have been curious to go back and try and pull it up, but we got a business to run, and I don't have all the time in the world to dig through common data sets for Ivy Leagues when it's not what my students are really focusing on. But I think the way we will usually talk about it is, let's say a school has 7% acceptance rate. That 7% acceptance rate is not the acceptance rate for the kids that I am talking to in a classroom in a Colorado high school, right? This is 7% is accepted. And this is including athletes, special circumstances, organizations with guaranteed spots, political or celebrity students. We've got high-flying students that are legacy. We've got gifts, athletics, all of these things. And then by the time they start looking at maybe the general population, then you're kind of getting closer to like half the class is already gone. Half the class is already gone before they're looking at the best students that don't have those one-ups. And then you have to assume, okay, so maybe I don't have a special one-up in this process. That means you only have to beat out every single other student that's doing nearly perfect statistically. And that's not even including the fact that if we are taking away all those special interests, there are still students that just have an immense amount of wealth backing them, that they've had opportunities to travel abroad or start a nonprofit, or a family member that has that professional expertise, or they can afford to, do rugby because they have a school that has it and they can buy the equipment, or they can be equestrians because they can afford a horse. Like, there's so many layers before you get to that student who's the best and the brightest in their own community, that it's very sad, because there are so many students that we talk to that say exactly what you said, right? They see 7% and they go, that's better than the lottery. Why not shoot my shot?
Right.
Well,
But and what I
it's more misguided than that. Like, we're still lumping all of those valedictorians into one bucket. But if you have a kid who's a valedictorian and has the perfect SAT scores from a school in South Dakota, they have a higher chance. They're the 1 in 4.
Yes,
it's not every valedictorian in the state of California.
Right.
And in the whole state of California, there's 7 of them. Like, 7 have an opportunity, kind of thing.
Right. There are so many different factors.
Right.
And what students and families need to hear is it's not about you. Like,
No,
it is about institutional priorities. And there's a lot of talk nowadays about equity, and schools sort of diversifying more as a matter of equity. No, not for these schools. It's not.
Right.
The institutional priorities have shifted in a certain way, where certain historically minoritized groups, now it's a big institutional push to do recruitment for those specific groups. Whereas for the longest time, there was none of that. This push really began in the 70s, which, as a function of the entire history of these schools, is not that long ago. So that's number one. Number two is, it's important to know, if you don't have just like a baseline credential, I mean, I would say, of being at least in the top 5% of your class, right, and having a lot of the attributes that we've already discussed here, your chances of getting in are not 7%, they're 0.
Right.
Sometimes it's a hard thing to explain to families, but it has to be said.
We get emails, outreach, we talk to students, we talk to parents, and the number of times that someone just says like, well, other students do get in who don't have perfect grades and scores. They're not wrong. Students do get in without perfect grades and scores, but it's not you or your student. It's unless you okay. So I think the hard part for parents and students is that they're comparing themselves to their peers that they know without actually having a sense of what these applications look like in the office. So they might put together an incredible application narrative, and they are phenomenal. They're incredible human beings, and they're insightful, and they're compassionate, and they're empathetic, and they're just really good people. And they don't stand a chance when you see the resume of some of these other students. And even those students sometimes aren't getting in.
Yeah.
It's all, everything is just siloed.
I don't think that we can talk about this topic without talking about K through 12 education in this country. Right. And one's ability to obtain you could say the credentials and the ability to market themselves through doing 20 hours a week of extracurricular work, that is very much, I would say that's not representative of most of the country. That is a very small slice of this country that's being trained in that manner. But there is something I wanted to bring up that maybe you guys have a better answer about this, because it's something that's been on my mind. It's important to note that 90% of all high school students in the U.S. are enrolled in public schools. That's through K through 12. For K through 12, 90% of students enrolled in public schools. I also believe that at least 75% of all students at Ivy or Ivy-like colleges, so 3 out of 4, are graduates of public high schools. Mm-hmm. Yet, when I look at the college matriculation statistics of very elite high schools, and I'm talking about like Exeter, mm-hmm, the Ivy prep schools in New York, Harvard Westlake, types of,
right.
Harvard Westlake. Jessica may have more to say about
Parker School in Northern California.
Mm-hmm.
Sure. Any of these sort of really elite private high schools, a huge percentage of their graduating class, sometimes more than a quarter, go on to Ivy or Ivy-like schools. I'm a graduate of a perfectly respectable public school in Baltimore. In my graduating class of 300, two were admitted to Ivies, and that was considered like really good, at this run of the mill public school. Yet, at some of these private high schools, it's like it's it's so many of them.
Right.
Can you explain this phenomenon?
Oh, I wish I could. I mean, we can talk about theories and we can talk about things like one off stories or certain data points we've seen. I mean, let's face it, when you are paying a college tuition every year from K to 12, there is an implication that you are paying for your student to get a scholarship that will pay for college, which I think goes for most private schools. When families think about it, they're like, this is an investment in your education. You're going to come here, you're going to take APs, you're going to take dual enrollments, you're going to get some courses so you can graduate early. We're not going to have to pay that fourth year. It's an investment for most families looking at private schools. I think once we get to these really, really elaborate private schools, these top 10, top 20, these feeder schools into the Ivy League system, I believe that most families don't think of it as an investment to get a scholarship or an investment to get into a college. It's an investment to get into those highly selective, highly rejective schools, because that is what the private school is known for. And that's where those people are paying $60K a year, for their 5-year-old to go learn colors and numbers. And it's disheartening. And I don't know exactly what the relationship is. I mean, statistically, we have to assume that there's some kind of understanding. I'm not going to say that there's like a you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours kind of thing. Or truthfully, if it's just, I know that in the admissions world, having good relationships with a school and a college is hugely important, even on the smaller scale. If we shrink it down, we look at Hendrix College, which is a much smaller, much less competitive than what we're talking about in Arkansas. Hendrix College really, really epitomizes this idea of counselors and schools inside of Arkansas. We have to have a good relationship with them, because that is where we're receiving our students. That's where we're receiving a lot of these community boons, so to speak. And I imagine that there is something similar, whether it's historical and it's become outdated, but maybe it's just a tradition, or if there is still a reason for that, I don't know. It's a good theory, and I wish that I could pry back the peels of what is going on behind these conversations to understand why is there such a statistical difference, because there are plenty of good people and great students and hard workers that don't go to those schools, that don't get nearly as high of a chance.
I think so. We can trace this back, right? Like, this is historical. These decisions are historical. These relationships that the Ivies and highly selectives have with these handful, it's really only a handful. It's a handful of boarding schools and a handful of private day schools that have like the really, really strong connections. And then there's the handful of big public schools that also have the same connections.
Right.
And this has been for many, many decades, well over 100 years, that they have consistently gotten students to come to the school and graduate on time and take advantage of opportunities and do great things. And then the school gets to, take credit for producing the student, right? So it makes sense from the admissions perspective, or like from the business perspective of the college, that like, of course they're going to more heavily weight an applicant from a school like Exeter, because Exeter has for centuries produced students that are a good fit for their institution and who do really great things, or have really wealthy parents who are going to do really great things for the school. They're just business decisions.
Well, it's interesting because one of the things that I hear from parents with kids in schools like this are like, oh, well, it's not as easy for us now, to get
Right.
into these schools. And I just want to like show them these statistics. No, these elite high schools gobble up a pretty significant percentage of seats at these Ivies,
Right.
whereas 90% of all high school students are in public schools. the vast majority of public high schools in the US have 0 students heading to
Yeah.
Ivies. So
Yeah.
it's just something, it's an interesting thing.
Something that used to really bother me when I was working in admissions. I think when I was working at Hendrix, our like middle 50% for the ACT was like a 27 to a 31, which in the grand scheme of things is pretty remarkable. I remember I would talk to students and they would be like, I have a horrible, horrible ACT score. And I'd be like, what is it? And they'd be like, I don't even want to tell you. I'm like, hey, this is a cool place. Like, I'm here to support you. And they'd be like, I have a 25. And it used to make me mad because I understand nowadays when students are in such high pressure environments or when they're trying to find those high ACTs to get like an honors college admittance or maybe like a certain threshold for like a really significant in-state scholarship. I get that. But it also reminds me how disconnected students are from the very vast majority of the educational lives of most teenagers in our country. There are schools that probably have existed for decades and maybe never had someone score above a 25 on the ACT. And it reminds me of how completely siloed even students who are not part of these super elite institutions, then they're just going to a run-of-the-mill, pretty solid public school that ranges the gambit, and they see those couple of high flyers from their school, and they see on the news all these like perfect SAT, perfect ACT, got into all 8 Ivy League stories, and they feel so incredibly inferior. And then they look at the stats and they feel like, you know what, the stats seem to think I'm inferior, and that always made me really upset, just because it showed a lack of awareness for the world, which was not their own fault. I don't expect students as teenagers to know what's going on across the globe in other teenagers' lives. But it made me sad at the same time because it demoralizes and it takes a lot of that fire out of them. And I think as people in education and people who love working with teenagers and younger adults, it's so sad to see that fire get stomped on a little bit when they did fantastic by statistical reasoning across the entire country. Just something that made me think of that.
Well, I'm really glad that you actually brought that up, Sawyer. This about test scores, because my next question has to do with that. During COVID, there were a lot of very abrupt changes to the higher education system and specifically to admissions. One of the most drastic of those being that the vast majority of schools, including the Ivies now, have gone test optional, meaning you are not required to submit SAT or ACT scores now, and that's going to be indefinite. I can't imagine that being brought back at a large scale. In the near future anyway. How do you think that this is going to affect applications to the highly selective schools?
It's why we're seeing more applications.
Yeah.
That's really the main thing. These admission rates keep going down because they're admitting the same number of students, but getting a lot more students to apply because more students have a 4.0 unweighted GPA than not in this country, I think. That's not a real stat from any actual citable source, but I would not be surprised at all. And I think that it's tough because then students feel like if you apply without a test score, you have the same odds of getting in as a student with a really good test score. And maybe that's true because the odds are like 0 to none. But for the students who are being admitted test optional, they are particularly exceptional human beings with exceptional applications, just like the rest of the applicant pool. And I think it's muddying everything. And we are huge fans of test optional landscape. When University of Chicago went test optional in 2018, we were like cheering from the sidelines, like finally. And then when the UCs finally made it through the court system and are test blind, and then Caltech was like, you know what, we also don't need scores, in the same year that MIT was like, we need scores again. Like, this is confusing for students, especially knowing like MIT is not really going to admit anyone who has like less than a 780, 790 math score, according to MIT. It's tough because we're such huge proponents of test optional, but we also know that having a high score has been particularly valuable in gaining admission to these schools, especially when everything else kind of looks the same.
Right.
Yeah, and I want to impart on any students and families who might be listening. Just because a school's gone test optional, that doesn't mean that they're easier to get into now if you did not have a good score, if that makes
Yeah.
sense. Generally speaking, the lists that I'm generating with families, they look pretty similar to the ones we were generating with the scores. I
Yeah.
think, I mean, I just want to put
I
that out
would
there.
I would agree with that. And building off what Jess said, I think that we can say without a shadow of a doubt test optional increased applications. No doubt there. I think that if schools wanted to be very transparent with their data, then we could see how many of those test optional students were admitted versus how many students that submitted tests were admitted. And I think that provides a little bit of a better layer. What I would like to see in a crazy theoretical world is I would like to see students with perfect scores submitting test optional and seeing if they are statistically admitted at the same rate as other students with perfect scores.
Yeah, not.
Yeah, it
No.
will never, ever, ever happen. But that, I think, is if we really wanted to learn more, is when we could get some of those put in some blinders for the system that we could
This is
start
what
to get
test
some
blinds should look like. Submit the
right.
scores, don't see them in the admission decisions, and then do the data analysis.
Right. So, I mean, we'll never see that, and that's a pipe dream that I can continue to pipe dream about. But I definitely think we've seen a lot more people who definitely have fallen into this, and this is a myth, not a fact, that because a college goes, test optional, that it is now easier or more open to more students. That's not true. The test optional students that are getting in are just as qualified as the students that submit test scores. And that means that for these selective schools, they are off the charts.
Yeah, and I would encourage anyone, if you're a good test taker and you think you're going to do well on the SAT or the ACT, by all means, take it.
Right.
Because I think that until we get to a test blind situation, that students with high scores in these areas are actually going to be at a huge advantage, like way more so than before, because so many people are going to be electing not to take them. So.
Well, and we're seeing that now with like the average SAT scores of admitted students, right? Like those middle 50% are insane. WashU in St. Louis is in the 99th percentile. The whole middle 50% is in the 99th percentile. We're seeing that across all of these highly selectives. But I think it's really important for people to understand that test optional is not actually new. Bowdoin went test optional in 1969, which was a long time ago, before even my parents were in college or like school. And they have continued to build an incredible incoming class of incredibly talented and academic and like impressive students every year since then, regardless of test scores. So what we do know is the scores don't really say much about a student, right? It's 4 hours on a Saturday. They might have food poisoning. We don't know. It really just doesn't do much for us. But MIT did explain why they went back to test scores. And it's because historically, because this is how they've done reviews, those test scores, when students have high test scores, they have been successful at the school. That's not to say that students without high test scores wouldn't be successful. It just means that that's the data point that they're going on, and that's been trusted all this time, and that's why they're going to continue to trust it. But there was an interview recently with the dean of admissions at Princeton, and the interviewer asked how many of the students who were not admitted could replace an admitted student without changing the makeup of the class or the rigor of the class or anything. They said 9 times, about 18,000 students. 18,000 qualified students were rejected from Princeton. Mm-hmm. And by qualified, I mean like could have been admitted and just didn't get that acceptance letter.
Which leads us to a natural question. Why not just increase the number of seats in your school or open a campus in the Midwest? Because that takes away from the cash. It's the scarcity that people are really after.
Well, and it's no longer the Ivy League because, as you said, that's a sports conference. Like the Ivy League doesn't mean there's Ivy on the buildings.
Yeah. I think it goes back to that idea that we all know, but nobody really likes to talk about, whether you're being hurt by it or whether you're a benefactor of it, is that exclusivity is what people are searching for. I think we can think of this in the sense of most of us can probably remember a time in elementary school where there was a popular clique. I'm not even talking about middle school. This is like when we're still young, that there was a popular clique. That popular clique only had maybe 3 people in it, and like you got shunned or accepted into that clique, and that was very big for you at that time. I know that this has happened to most people I talk to, and it's the same thing one could argue about resorts, about gated communities, about any type of product you might own. I mean, this is branding, right? Peloton has done such a good job to create for a very healthy cult, in the sense of that. Tesla was like this for a while, right? Like if you owned a Tesla, you were part of an exclusive group of people. iPhone, when it first came out, still had this kind of thing. There is a desire for people to have this exclusivity, to be special. And I'm not, psychologist, psychiatrist, but we see it, and that's what a lot of marketing is, right? It's marketing to this idea of an in-group, to feel special, to feel unique. Like you can show up at a place and somebody can have the same car as you, and you can be like, whoa, like, hey, we've got the same car, we're connected. Even though you know nothing about that person, they might not have anything to do with who you would normally hang out with. And I think we see that in highly selective, highly rejective schools. It's the idea of being in the in crowd.
It's the same thing as when like a kid picks up a guitar for the first time. I can't tell you the number of 6-year-olds I knew, like in my own life, that their first guitar was like a fancy Gibson or Fender. Like, you know these names. You might not know why that might be significant, but you know these names, and that's exclusivity. And these are kids that like can't even make a bar chord because their hands are too small. Like everyone wants what other people can't have.
And it is an interesting question, though. Like, how big would we'll pick on Harvard? How big would Harvard have to get before it lost that? Right? I mean, would they have to double, triple? Would they?
Yeah, because the second Harvard says we're going to double. Sorry, what?
Sorry, they could do an online school. Anyone can
Yeah.
enroll.
They have an online school. They have an extension school, and you still get your Harvard email address, but it's the extension school.
I'm talking about undergrad. Like they can open an open undergrad Harvard school, a degree granting institution that's online. It could be free. They have the money for. I'm just saying these are things that could make things truly more equitable. Hope you're listening, Harvard.
Yeah.
Okay. The second Harvard says, hey, this year we're going to double the size of our class, what do you think happens to application numbers? Because suddenly there's space for me.
Yeah. So Jessica, you have a very interesting backstory when it comes to this very topic. You were accepted to, I know, at least one Ivy League school and chose against it. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, it was probably, I said this before, I kept my acceptance letter. It was probably one of the harder decisions I've had to make because everything in me, everyone said I have to go to the school. It was Penn. It was Penn. We're throwing Penn under the bus here. And I was really excited about the program. I had talked to a couple students who had been in the program. This was for grad school, this particular scenario. I went to visit after being admitted and sat in on a class, most boring class I've ever sat in on ever as like a student. And it wasn't because of the content or the teacher. Teacher was great. Content was awesome because it was criminology. The students were disengaged, and they were disengaged in the classroom and in the hallway before going into the classroom. And that really bothered me, especially because it was my only class that I got to see. And maybe it was an off day, or maybe that cohort wasn't as cohesive as other cohorts might be. I don't know, whatever it was, I wound up back in the office of the chair of the criminology department. And I asked, why should I choose Penn over these other options? And the response I got was, well, it's Penn. And I was like a California kid coming. I didn't know they called it Penn. I kept calling it UPenn. They don't like that. And like, that's how like far removed I was. Meanwhile, like my grandfather did go to Harvard, and like, I understand that was in the 1930s. I understand the societal implications of not just getting in, but actually going to one of these schools and having a degree that says the name of these schools. And I kept waiting for more. Like, okay, because it's Penn, what can Penn do for me that these other programs can't? Like, sell me on this. And the selling point was the name of the school. And I left that office, and my mom had come on the trip with me. Thanks, Mom. And I like met up with her outside, and I was like, I don't think I want to go here. She was like, well, we had plans to like look at apartments just in case. I had a friend who was going to start a data science program at Penn the same year. We could have been roommates, would have been great. And I walked out of that office just feeling so defeated. Like I worked so hard for this, and the selling point is the name. And that was just so not enough for
So
me.
where did you end up?
University of Denver. And my reasons for choosing University of Denver over UPenn, or Penn as they like to be called, was at University of Denver, my program was the forensic psychology program. So it was a little bit more clinical, which I really liked the research side of things, but I also had never had clinical experience. So I thought that was kind of important. But it was hands-on. They put me in a field placement by week 3. Like, we had to apply for and get like actual experiential learning opportunities that we worked as like part-time jobs, where literally week 3 of this program, I'm still learning about interviewing techniques and how to diagnose people. And I have one-on-one clients, and I'm running male domestic violence offender groups. And like, I was a victims advocate, and we were working with substance abuse disorders. And there was just so much that I could do just because the school created an education system that wasn't in the classroom. Like, sure, we had classroom stuff, but I can't even tell you the classes I took, because what I learned the most, not in class. It's like any job, any adult listening to this who has had a job, that could be students too who have had a job, know that sure, if you work at Jamba Juice, they can give you that list of like the recipes for each smoothie, and you can learn them and make a fine smoothie, but you learn by doing. Like, at the basic level of like food services, you learn by doing. So imagine what happens for actual like clinical degree programs, right?
And I mean, I don't know how much merit aid or aid at all that Penn offered you, but I would imagine that if you had to take on any debt at the University of Denver as an in-state student, it wasn't anything compared to what you were going to do at Penn.
Well, so Penn offered me a scholarship, and DU initially didn't. It's a private school, so it's actually pretty expensive.
Oh, I
Um,
apologize, Coloradans.
no one cares. I'm only saying that because I actually leveraged the offer from Penn to DU. I wrote the head of the school, hi Levita. I said, like, I really want to go to your school, but Penn, like the University of Pennsylvania, is offering me their highest scholarship, which was $4,500. Is there anything you can do to make this an opportunity for me? And they came back very quickly with money. And then I had to give it back because I got a scholarship through the Department of Defense. But that was a separate entity, and I was like committed to DU with the scholarship that they did provide after I leveraged Penn, which was like the most baller move of my life, I will say.
Well, and you kept an open mind. I think that that's important to say too. I mean, you just were like, I'm going to do Penn even if it appears that I won't be happy here, which I think a lot of students do that.
Yeah.
So it's to be admired, frankly. So I have one more question for both of you. What do you recommend to students? What advice would you give to students who have their sights set on the Ivies?
Figure out your why. If you can't answer why you want a specific school, there's no way you're getting in. And also figure out which Ivies, because you see in the news all the time students are applying to and getting into all 8 Ivies, and they're so dramatically different in every way, shape, and form that it makes no sense when you think about college fit, and like one being is probably not the best fit for both Dartmouth and Princeton. Just as an example, like, find your reasons for wanting them, and then find other schools that meet those needs too, so that when you go through this process, it's you making the decision and not the school.
Yeah. I'm gonna echo Jess's point, but I'm gonna put a little bit of a spin on it here. I would say something that I really struggled with through teenage years and my younger years is I fought just life. I fought so many things, right? Like I fought to get good grades. I fought to get a leading role in a play. I fought to become more independent. Everything was a battle. Everything was a struggle. And I spent so much time throughout my teenage years doing that, that when I started to reach a place where there were no more struggles or there were no more fights or that they weren't as important or maybe not as common, that it made me uncomfortable to be content or uncomfortable to be happy with where I was. One thing I would say is that you are going to, all of life is a struggle, and that's not to say life's bad, but we all struggle, right? We are on a rock floating through space. Like life is pretty crazy and bonkers and big out there. You cannot fight every single battle. You cannot try to appease everybody. And I think most people that get older begin to realize this, and they select what they care about or the why. Going back to that idea of what is a good car is what you're looking for, right? What are you looking for? And that's what makes it good. So I would say, to Jess's point as well, if you want to apply to these incredibly selective universities, go for it. I'm never going to say don't do it. I might say I don't think it's a good use of your time. I don't think it's a strategically advisable move. I might use language like that. But what I will say is that most students cannot struggle to apply to all of these and struggle to create perfect grades and to be engaged and to be happy and healthy. It's too much. If you're going to go through this process, you have to choose your battles and you have to know why. Don't sit there and waste your precious time and energy applying to places that you have no intention of actually going to, and you don't even know why you would go there, and you don't even know the difference between them and a colleague institution. I would say that don't limit yourself. Nurse that fire, nurse that passion, push yourself. Don't ever resign yourself to a fate that hasn't been written yet. But at the same time, don't needlessly fight all the time. Choose your battles and know why you're fighting them. And if you can keep that in your mind while you're going through the application process, that extra essay or that early morning college visit, if you know why you're there and you know that it's something that you actually really want and you want to put that effort into, it comes out a million times better than just starting to throw all your energy and effort into the darkness and hoping that it's going to hit somewhere. So
and navigating it that way opens doors to all of the possibilities, not just these possibilities.
Yeah, that's what I would say is the best advice my mother has ever given me, and I always quote this, is just choose your battles. And it seems so simple, but it's so hard for so many people, myself included, to choose your battles and what battles are worth fighting and why would you fight them. And if you can think about the college search in that way, instead of just throwing out applications because something's test optional or throwing out applications because it's free or because you have the Common App and that makes it easier to do nowadays, like, it's not free. You're spending time, you're spending energy, you're investing your life into this process. And I want to make sure that when you're investing these things, that you're investing for a reason, that there is a why, that you're excited for it. And that can be from the student who is competitive for an Ivy League institution to that student that is really striving to make it into a regional university. And that's like what they're going for. And that's their Ivy League. Like, I want to nurse that mentality, but I also want students to be so aware of their own health and their own time that they have in their lives.
Well, I think that's a wonderful note to end on. Thank you all. Thank you both so much for participating in this conversation. It was wonderful.
Yeah.
Do you guys have any closing remarks to our viewers?
Closing remarks for me. I would say this is an important process. It is not the most important process, and is certainly not going to be the end of your life at the end of this process. And so I think that if students can bring a little bit more levity, get out of that idea of the rat race and the pressure cooker, find out where they are going to be, dare I use the word, happy, which is not always easy to identify, but probably something we could all work on a little bit more. that I think they're going to come out of it not only with a happier and healthier process, but also with schools that are probably going to reward them with experiences that will prepare them for the rest of their lives, personally, professionally, and academically. And I think that marketing is a very powerful tool that's made us all believe that we're chasing after things that we don't even know why or if they're a good fit for us. And I think if you can start to think about what do you want and not what do parents want or what does the branding want, I think that's a big difference. Aside from that, yeah, I think that would be it.
I highly encourage students to fall in love with every school that they apply to, even if the likelihood of being admitted is a lot higher. I can't tell you the number of students we've had turn down the Ivy for their likely schools because they were better fits, better opportunities, better funding, infinite reasons. And I'm so proud of them every time they make that decision, as much as I am proud of the ones who choose to go to these selective schools. But as you're navigating this process, it can be a lot more fun and a lot less daunting when you think about what you need and want in a school. Find all of those schools and focus on all of those, not just the ones that are hardest to get into. And then the hard part in this process is making that final decision of which one gets you. It's really nice when that decision is in your hands and not necessarily in the hands of the business people behind that admission desk.
Right.
Wonderful ending note. Thank you. Thank you both so much.
Yeah, no problem.
It was a pleasure. Thanks for having us.
Super happy to be here. Love talking about college.